Okay, let's talk about setting up FTK in the best method that we can. First of all, you have to understand that FTK works on input-output. The faster the input-output to the drives, the better. So what Access Data recommends is that you set it up so that you have a database drive, a cache drive, and a temp drive. And then you point FTK to use those drives so that you don't have a bottleneck all going to one or two drives trying to go in and out, because FTK will write massive amounts of read writes to the hard drives themselves. And basically what I do is I also put my evidence on one drive here. So then what happens is my evidence gets sucked out of the evidence drive, goes up, gets processed, temporary files, database, temporary files, database, temporary files, database to the cache drive, and then so on. You need a pretty robust computer to be running this. FTK will run on just about anything, but with that said, it's going to take a while if you don't have at least a Core i7. If you look up here in the right hand corner, you can see I've got a Core i7 running 8 cores. I've got 32 gigabytes of RAM running, and at any time it can take I've seen these things max out, every one of them at 100%, and I've run upwards of 24 to 27 gigabytes of RAM. So you can see that this bad boy takes a lot of system resources. When you're running FTK, you don't want to be dinking around with other programs in the background. You don't want to be running anything that might be hungry. Basically, when we set up FTK to run, you bring in your evidence, you hit start, and away you go. Okay, you walk away, go get dinner, let it run overnight. As a matter of fact, most of us run this stuff overnight, so that way we come in the morning, we're ready to roll, and we can get going on it. So let's talk about setting up FTK. When you put in a disk to start FTK, this is what you're going to get, the flash screen here. First things first, you're going to have to install the database. Now, FTK used to give you the options of using Oracle, Microsoft SQL, or the Postgres. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, so I apologize. Now, with the latest versions of FTK, like 5.1, you only get the Postgres option. There is no more SQL. There is no more Oracle options. So go ahead and install, accordingly to your database. Like I'm using a 64-bit system, it brings up the installer. And I'm not going to install because it'll mess up my system. But you need to make sure that you point it to where you want it to go, and make sure that you point the installer to install to the database drive, not to your root, your C, but to a database drive. Now you can use a partition, it's just not as efficient. The other thing to be said about those drives, when you put those together, these two drives here, my database drive and my temp drive, are both Velociraptors, 10,000 RPM drives with a SATA 3 connection going to a SATA 3 connection on my board. That means that I have the highest input-output that I can get roll into both those drives. Those are the ones that do the most read writes, the database and the temp. So you want to get those as fast as possible. So once you get that done and you get the database installed, and you have it set in there, and you have your temp folders over here, and you can see I got FTK temp, then you can go ahead and do your FTK install. Again, pretty straightforward, 64-bit if you're running 64-bit Windows, or 32-bit if you're stuck in the dark ages. Now there are a couple things that you need to understand. FTK can use a distributed engine. Now, if you have slave machines on the network that you can install the distributed engine, you can go ahead, put this in, and install the engine, and then you connect those. We'll talk about that in the FTK overview of how to do that. And then what FTK does is it uses a distributed processing model to go ahead and send bits of processing out to the CPUs of those computers. It speeds things up if you have a good, robust computer that you can use as a slave. We've tried it with just piece of garbage compacts that we took out of the garbage, and it still sped up things 10%. But when you're processing 5 million files, 10% is a big deal. So take a look at that. If you have the ability to do that, go ahead and set up distributed processing engine. Understand that you cannot install the distributed processing engine on a machine that FTK is installed on. So keep that in mind. As far as other products go, the license manager, you will want to install that. Registry Viewer, You need to install that if you're going to be reading registry files, the SAM, the software files, and we will talk about all that. It's a great way to go ahead and read the keys and keep things going. You need to install that. Imager, great program, one of my favorite programs of all time. It's a freebie. You can install it here, or you can download it from there and install it. Password Recovery Toolkit, PRTK. PRTK is what we use for our brute force attacks. Let me bring it up here. Basically, with PRTK, what you're going to do is you're going to make a whatever, knock it off Windows. You're going to make a list, your golden word list, and you're bring it in here, and then you're going to brute force attack whatever you need to to crack. Labor intensive, yeah. Resource intensive, yeah. Massive amounts of resources involved. Let me bring up while we're at it here. Let me bring up Registry Viewer for you also to take a look at it. Registry Viewer here, this is what the interface looks like when you open up a registry file. You can bring it in and it'll populate the keys and you can read them from there. Very simple, very easy. And then code meter, that is going to be for your dongle. Remember 3264-bit. Make sure you get those in there, and make sure Adobe Reader, get the latest version, and make sure that that's installed. Once everything is installed, you're good to go with that, and you have everything set up. Go ahead, make sure your dongle's in. Where did my FTK go? There it is. Open up FTK, and FTK is going to bring you the screen. You will know that everything is installed correctly when you get this. The first time you bring it up, it's going to ask you to set up a administrator user. That's cool, go ahead. So I'll put in my password. Brings you to the main screen. Okay, I have live active cases here, guys, ignore those. So in here you're going to have your processing engine configuration. Remember we talked about the distributed processing? This is where you're going to add those other IP addresses. You bring them in here, you enable them, and now we'll do it. I've got a pretty robust machine here. I don't need to have that in there. You can recover processing jobs. You can restore images. Here's where you set your preferences, your ports for everything else. If you want to use a different look, I don't know what the difference between the looks is. Let's see what does Windows 7 look like. Okay, and you can your backup aux, everything else, and then you have your KFF, your known file filters. Make sure KFF is a little touchy. Quite frankly, we don't use it because it slows us down a lot. Here you have your manage your carvers, where you can bring your custom carvers, all that. We'll talk about that more later. Filters, photo DNA, processing, your help guides, cases new, backup, restore, delete, all that. Your database, password, administrator users, session management, and you can configure it, and everything else, and exit. Remember, the biggest thing with setting up FTK is to get these drives set up correctly. This database and the temp, cases and evidence. Now I've seen some guys who combine the cases and the evidence. I've seen some guys combine the temp and the database. But this has been what's been working for us, having this set up here. Most of us are graduates of the National Computer Forensic Institute, and this is what we use. We learn from them to make sure that everything gets rolling so good. And when you get something that's running great, go from there. I would suggest, if you can, your database and your temp drives. We're testing SSDs right now because of the speed of the SSDs and the read-write to see what kind of productivity that brings to us. The only problem we're worried about is that FTK will do massive amounts of reads in there, and those things have a limited lifespan. So we are a little bit hesitant on that right now, but you know what? If the testing shows that it's not going to be a big deal, then we'll go ahead and do it from there. So that's how to get FTK set up and going on your machine. Remember, get the database installed, then install FTK, then install Password Recovery Toolkit, Registry Viewer, your code meter, and your license managers. Make sure that everything's up and running. When you open FTK, it's going to ask you to connect to the database. That's going to be the hard part, but you can get her done. Always ask questions, and thanks a lot. We'll talk to you on the next one.